Hey y'all, welcome to Sandy's Library. I'm Sandy, and in this video I'm going to continue to talk about the Fullers. These are my grandmother's people, so if you need visuals, there are links posted in the description outlining both of my grandparents' family trees. Today though, I'll be discussing my great-grandmother Lizzie Fuller's parents, Frances Marion Fuller and Nancy Isabella Hawkins, who were known by their family and friends as Marion and Belle. But before we talk about them as a couple, let's explore their lives prior to their marriage in 1866. And you know, I feel like bucking tradition, so we're going to let Marion go first. My second great-grandfather was born March 1st, 1845 in Butler County, Alabama. He died April 27th, 1927 in the community of Guyton in Ouachita Parish, Louisiana. Unfortunately, we don't know a whole lot about Marion's childhood prior to the Civil War, so I'm assuming it was pretty normal for the time. We do know that in February of 1862, 1 month before he turned 17, Marion enlisted in the Confederate Army in Butler County, Alabama. He served in Company H of the 33rd Alabama Infantry. Old family tales say that during the Civil War, Marion's company was camped out somewhere near his home in Alabama. Our half-first cousin reports that Marion would fight the enemy during the day, and then he'd sneak back home at night to plow the fields by the light of the moon. Well, it's a damn good thing they called off the fighting at night, now ain't it? Our half-cousin also reports that there was a food shortage for the Confederacy during the latter part of the war. Maybe so, in a big picture kind of way, but I feel like our half-cousin is using this as a means to justify a not-so-favorable detail about Marion Fuller, especially since a couple of sentences ago he was claiming that Marion was camped out close enough to home where he could actually go home at night to plow the fields, and remember, he did that by the light of the moon. And if you think about it, if that truly were the case, if he was that close to home, wouldn't he have food available to him? I mean, the majority of Southerners were farmers, and his neighbors were his sympathizers, mostly. So, in my mind, he shouldn't have had a whole lot of problems foraging for food. But, nevertheless, our half-cousin states that Marion was forced to steal because of this food shortage. And he uses my grandfather's name and his words, and most certainly out of context, that Marion had to steal to eat as a means to justify the act of stealing. But you know what? I think it was a little more than necessity that caused him to step across that line, because our half-cousin goes on to say that Marion became an accomplished pickpocket during those lean years. My question is, since when do you need to be an accomplished pickpocket to be able to steal enough food to feed yourself? And you know, the concept of Marion's sticky fingers is not a new one for me. I've heard these stories before. But you know, our half-cousin has a peculiar way of telling these stories. He seems to be bragging a little bit, as if he's proud of Marion's talents, and I use that term loosely. He says, one day Marion sat down beside this man who had a sack of about a dozen eggs, and Grandpa was sitting there for quite a while and had stolen every one of those eggs. Before the man knew it, Marion had carried off an armful of eggs, leaving the unfortunate man unaware. So, what was this guy? Deaf, dumb, and blind? How in the hell are you supposed to carry off about a dozen eggs in your arms without being noticed? It would have been nice if our half-cousin had clarified that my grandfather was only repeating the tales that Marion had once told him. This was not his opinion of how things were, and I guarantee you my grandfather never took Marion's tall tales seriously. That's why he always laughed with that Lloyd... Sorry guys, I'm stumbling over my words today. And I just really can't help that. But so we're going to soldier on. Let me start over with that. That's why he always laughed, that loud, boisterous laugh of his, when he'd recount some of the stories that he himself had been told by Marion. He knew they were served with a side order bullshit, and he also thought they were funny. It's just too bad our half-cousin didn't see the irony instead of taking it as gospel. But anyway, another story about Marion's Civil War escapades happened apparently on a night after a major battle. And hey, I thought he was out plowing the fields at home at night. I'm just being facetious, y'all. But anyway, Marion and the rest of the soldiers were just exhausted and being on the move. When they came across this little creek, they decided to make camp. And FYI, in some versions of this tale, Marion was one of the cooks. But whether he was or not is irrelevant to the story, where the cooks prepared biscuits and gravy for supper, utilizing water from the stream. And yep, we Southerners will eat biscuits and gravy for dinner. So anyway, the next morning, while the soldiers were out exploring their surroundings, they began to smell this foul odor coming from a section of the creek upstream from where they had made camp. Unfortunately, upon reaching that portion of the creek, they found a number of horses lying in the creek bed where they had been slaughtered. Marion reported that this was a very bloody scene, what with the water in the creek mingling with the blood of the slain animals, and as we would expect, it made the soldiers sick to think that they had used the water from the creek downstream to prepare their supper the night before. I wonder, if we looked into the 33rd Alabama or whatever, what do you think the odds would be that we'd discover that typhoid or something had rolled through their camp at some point during the war? And it's also worth noting that, without any proof, our half-cousin blames the slaughtering of the horses on the Yankees. And y'all, I have never heard anyone who's ever repeated this story in front of me say that Union troops were responsible for slaughtering those horses. I never have. Maybe he got that shit from Aunt Allie too. The old family tales say that Marion was wounded twice during the Civil War. The first time, he said he was in the Battle of Murfreesboro. And as the story goes, at one point, while the Confederate soldiers were retreating, it's reported that the Union soldiers fired at them. So, while running, Marion's thinking if he could just get to that log in front of him, then he could use it for cover. He didn't quite make it to the log, though. He was shot in the back of the leg on the lower part of his thigh. The second and final time that Marion was wounded, he said he was on his way to Atlanta. And this time, he actually was lying behind a log when he was shot. It happened as he rose up to take a look at his surroundings. The bullet entered his back and the shoulder area. He survived both injuries, obviously, or a ton of people, including myself, wouldn't be here right now. But anyway, family reports are that Marion had trouble with his back for the rest of his life. Marion has said that he was on furlough when the surrender came, and in later years he drew a pension for his service. It's also worth noting that after the surrender at Appomattox, Marion did not surrender according to Civil War records. While searching through said records, I found the following. Francis Marion Fuller, a member of Company H, 33rd Alabama Infantry, CSA, was captured at Greenville, Alabama on April 26, 1865. So, he was a prisoner of war for at least a couple of weeks, because it wasn't until May 6, 1865 that he was paroled and released in Montgomery, Alabama. Marion said that he, along with his father and some of their other relatives, had to sign oaths stating they would not bring arms against the United States again, and once they did that, they were released. And for what it's worth, I have seen reference to this in historical records. I also find it interesting that the side that lost was able to draw pensions after the war. It's like, you signed an oath not to bring arms against the United States again? So, we're going to pay you for your service when you did bring up arms against the United States the first time. That's the good old US of A logic. It's crazy, ain't it? But anyway, we're not exactly sure when Marion met Belle, but considering they were from different counties in Alabama, and they lived about 25 miles apart, so it's unlikely that they met prior to the aftermath of the Civil War. Plus, my grandmother always said that Marion and Belle met when the Civil War was ending, and that's a claim that supports my theories. But before we get into Marion and Belle as a couple, let's talk a little bit about Belle first. She was born Nancy Isabella Hawkins. She was the daughter of William Hawkins and Caroline McClaney. And if anybody had a plantation in this scenario, it was the McClaney family. But we'll talk about that later. It's generally accepted by the family that Belle was born on January 1st, 1849 in Turnbull, Monroe County, Alabama. That said, I haven't seen any historical records beyond her death and burial information that places her date of birth on January 1st, 1849. And for me, the 1900 census does nothing to clear it up either. While that year's census does show a birth year of 1849, it also shows us that December was written down first as the month of birth. Then it was crossed out and replaced with January. The reason this makes things more confusing for me is because in the records for the charter members of the Lone Star, Alabama RLDS Church located in Monroe County, Alabama, Belle told them her date of birth was December 31st, 1848. I'm not sure how many people know about that, and even if they did, it was only a difference of one day, so maybe they figured, what difference does a day make? I've never been able to find any historical records to confirm or clarify when her true birth date actually was, and since everybody else has adopted January 1st, 1849 as her birth date, I have too. But I just wanted y'all to be aware that, for reasons unknown, when Belle was baptized on February 17th, 1867, she told them her date of birth was December 31st, 1848. Plus, the fact that the 1900 census taker wrote down December and then crossed it out, well, it makes me wonder, was she hiding from something? It's like, whoever talked to the census taker, the first thing they told them was December. And then it was like they realized that wasn't the date they were supposed to be giving out, so they corrected themselves and said, oh, sorry, I meant January. I mean, y'all, there has to be some reason why the guy first wrote down December and then crossed it out and replaced it with January. But anyway, that's just one of those puzzling little mysteries about Belle that bugs me. So anyway, while Belle's childhood appears to have been one of privilege, the stories that she told about it, well, let's just say, the ones I heard, they leave a lot to be desired. But let's talk about this plantation that she grew up on. That, you know, the one that our half-cousin mislabels as the Hawkins plantation. I'm sure he heard that from Aunt Allie too. But here's the thing. I don't know if she was confused or if he just didn't understand the words coming out of her mouth. And honestly, y'all, either scenario is very likely to have been the case. That said, if you're going to try to stick a family name on this plantation, you'd be more correct in saying the McClamey plantation. And sorry. And I'll try to explain why in a bit. First, I'm going to tell you a story that Aunt Allie told our half-cousin in one of those 1980 interviews. And it's a story that I believe she mostly made up, and I'm going to explain why I think this. But first, let's just go ahead and get the fabrication out of the way. And, like all good fibs, this one too is rooted in a grain of truth. See, it's very true that family tales say Caroline McClamey was basically a mean old bitch, even when she was young. And here's what I think happened. Because Aunt Allie had heard everyone saying repeatedly how cruel Belle's mother was, when Aunt Allie ran out of stories to tell, she found something she could easily expound upon. So she decides to take what she thinks she knows about the era, which incidentally includes every freaking stereotype in the book, and she uses that to pad the story she's making up about Belle's childhood. Incidentally, she further corroborates her completely fabricated story of Belle's childhood by combining it with a well-known tale about Belle's mother's family in the last days of the Civil War when Belle was a teenager. Except Aunt Allie forgot that she was a teenager when it happened. So, I'm basically just going to tell you the story that Aunt Allie reported to our half-cousin. His version is a little bit confusing, so I'm taking the liberty to align it properly for maximum understanding. I'd like to say that I'll wait until the end to add my thoughts, but let's face it, we all know that's not going to happen. Okay, so now that I've explained that the Hawkins plantation should have been labeled the McClamey plantation, and that I believe that most of this story to be fabricated by Aunt Allie, nevertheless, here we go. The following story was said to have taken place in Monroe County, Alabama during the Civil War. Excuse me. I'd better take a drink here. My throat is... told y'all I have throat issues. Sorry. Okay. The following story was said to have taken place in Monroe County, Alabama during the Civil War. Marion and Belle were living with her mother, Caroline McClamey Hawkins. Aunt Allie Maddox, who told the story, believed that William Hawkins had already died. So, y'all, let me just say that if our half-cousin had bothered to check a few historical records, he would have seen that Aunt Allie had no idea what she was talking about. And I wouldn't have to be repeating this load of crap so I can give an accurate portrayal of what actually happened. Okay, so what's wrong with this opening? Okay, fact. William Hawkins did not die prior to the Civil War. He died in 1872. Fact. During the Civil War, William Hawkins served in the 59th Mounted Infantry CSA, which is probably why he wasn't home when this particular story that Aunt Allie references actually took place. Fact. Belle Hawkins was born in 1849. She was not married to Marion Fuller during the Civil War. They married later in 1866. Marion was from Butler County, Alabama, while Belle was from Monroe County, Alabama, so I'm not even sure that they knew each other during the Civil War. But anyway, I have heard the gist of this story, and I can tell you with certainty that at best Aunt Allie is confused about why Belle is living with her mother. To put it simply, in 1860, Belle is living with her mother and her father because she's only 11 years old. So, history tells us that the Civil War began on April 12, 1861, and ended with a surrender at Appomattox on April 9, 1865. So, let's break that down. Belle was 12 when it began, and she was 16 when it ended. Plus, she and Marion didn't marry until 1866. So, now that we understand the real reasons why William wasn't around during the Civil War and why Belle was still in the Hawkins household, let's continue with our half-cousin's version of Allie's story. He states specifically that because William was dead, Caroline had to work in the fields supervising the enslaved people. At least part of that statement is not true. William was not dead. He was away serving in the Confederate Army. If anything, Caroline's over at her father's place supervising people over there. That's where the idea of the plantation comes from anyway. The next part I've edited because I just can't bring myself to use the racist terms that our half-cousin found so easy to litter throughout his manuscript. So anyway, our half-cousin continues saying that Belle had an enslaved housemaid who took care of her and that Belle loved her very much. Our half-cousin goes on to say that Belle cared little for her own mother because she felt that Caroline had been cruel to her. On the other hand, Belle loved the enslaved housemaid because when she got hurt or anything happened, she could go crying to her. Allie said that Belle's cruel mother would wake her up very early in the morning and tell her to go to work. The enslaved housemaid, however, felt sorry for little Belle, so she laid coats and blankets on a bench in the kitchen for her to lie down on and go back to sleep. And whenever the enslaved housemaid heard Caroline coming, she would wake Belle up so her mother wouldn't know she'd been sleeping. My question is, who did Belle's chores if she was sleeping? And then we have our half-cousin wrapping up Aunt Allie's line of crap by saying all of the Hawkins children had their own personal enslaved servants who were also children. And they would accompany the Hawkins children wherever they wanted to go, and they ran errands for them too. Not only is this offensive to brag about shit like that, but to me it's even worse when it's a load of crap. And trust me, y'all, there's no way I'd ever tell this story if I couldn't dispute it because it's nothing but effing brag about. You know, it's bullshit. And I will explain in a bit why this cannot possibly be true. But for now, let's just continue with a story that I know as The Disappearance of the Family Silver. From here, Allie's story is fairly accurate, albeit embellished. And we all know that I'm going to let y'all know when she misspeaks. So, I heard this story takes place in the final days of the Civil War when Belle was a teenager. And it was most likely in April of 1865 when Union troops marched through Alabama, capturing those who refused to surrender. It said that the family heard the Union soldiers were coming, so they sent a scout who returned saying the Union soldiers were just up the road. And let's remember, neither the Hawkins nor the McClamey men were at home. They were either hiding out or getting captured. So anyway, the Union troops are on their way just up the road, and Belle's mother, Caroline, had heard that they would steal anything they could get their hands on. So, as the story goes, Caroline instructed the old butler, a recently freed individual, to take the silver, which consisted of items such as pitchers, trays, bowls, platters, and eating and serving utensils, put it in a gunny sack, and take it out and hide it somewhere that it'd be safe from looting. In other versions of the story, including the one I heard, Caroline accompanies the old butler as they search for a hiding place in the woods behind the house. It's said, though, that Caroline could hear the Union troops approaching the main house, and she began to worry about the family and went back to the house, leaving the old butler to take care of hiding the silver. It's worth noting that in the version my grandmother told, she always refers to the house in question as the main house, which she reported to be Caroline's father's house. The next bit that our half-cousin inserts I'm going to share with y'all just to show you what kind of person we're dealing with. This is his take on the Union soldiers. And this is none of my opinion, but here we go. The hateful Yankees rode into the Hawkins plantation and burned their beautiful antebellum home and everything they had. They had no food, no clothes, no furniture, nothing left, and no place to live. And they had small children there to be taken care of too. But the Yankees didn't care. They just rode away. This may be one of the big reasons why Southerners call them damn Yankees. Oh my God. Okay, so for me, our half-cousin didn't even see that what the Hawkinses and McClamies were defending was wrong. He didn't see the cruelty or inhumanity of slavery at all. In Allie's fable, she ends her story saying, after all the trouble was over, the Hawkins family found their faithful butler dead a few days later. Well, in all the versions I heard, they all ended with the butler returning to the main house soon after Caroline did. And, as the story goes, he returned to the house to try and help protect the women and children, which resulted in one of the Union soldiers cracking him upside the head with the butt of his gun. It's said that he was nursed by Caroline and the other recently freed women who never left the plantation, but that he succumbed to his injury and died a few days later. It was said that sometime later Caroline returned to the tree looking for the silver, but it was gone. And this is the part that Sissy and her siblings always laughed about when they relayed this story. The family, whether it was the Hawkinses or the McClamies or both, it's said that they dug up the entire countryside looking for that silver. It's even said that Marion and Belle went back to Alabama years later so Belle could look for the silver again. But they never found it. And to the best of my knowledge, y'all, it's never been found. For all we know, it could still be buried out there in the Alabama countryside. And that was in Monroe County, Alabama. And the area that they lived in was called Turnbull. I don't know if that area still exists, but Monroe County, there you go, treasure hunting. Okay, so just how much of this story do I believe? Well, I have no doubt that there was some silver that was lost during the Civil War. This was a story that not only Lizzie's children told, but Lizzie's brothers and sisters' families also passed down this tale as well. All of Willie's children have told me at one time or another about the family's missing silver, so I believe that much is true. And I'm going to explain why I believe what I believe and why I don't believe what I don't believe. And one thing I don't believe is that William Hawkins's family lived in an antebellum mansion. No, I don't believe that at all. That said, I do believe the Hawkins and McClamey families as a whole owned a large amount of land collectively that was classified as a plantation, with each relative working his or her share of the land on their own. But the Hawkins family alone most certainly did not own a plantation. The fact of the matter is, on both the 1850 and 1860 slave schedules, William Hawkins is listed as owning 2 slaves. Look, y'all, you're not running a plantation on 2 people. That said, I do believe there was a plantation that was collectively owned by Caroline's family, but William Hawkins only owned a very small portion of it. So, we can pretty much discount Aunt Allie's claim that all of the Hawkins children had their own personal servant. Thank God. What I can't figure out is why in the hell would she want to make something like that up? So, on the 1860 census in Monroe County, Alabama, William Hawkins' real estate is valued at just $500. His personal property is valued at $1,500. And granted, back in 1860, $500 could get a farmer a decent 2-room house, but you ain't getting no antebellum mansion out of it. And right next door to the Hawkinses is Caroline's brother, John McClamey. His real estate is valued at $2,500, and his personal estate is valued at $6,000. But the bulk of the plantation was owned by Mark McClamey, John and Caroline's father. His real estate is valued at $7,000, and his personal estate is worth $25,000. So, if there was an antebellum mansion, it belonged to Mark McClamey. That said, I've never heard it referred to as such. In the tales that I've heard, it was always that Caroline was protecting her father's house. And as for the Hawkins family and the notion of it being their plantation, I took a look at the 1850 census too, in which William's father, John Hawkins' real estate is valued at $1,000. John Hawkins died in 1853. He had a number of children, but as the oldest son, William probably received the bulk of his estate. And that's probably where the bulk of William's estate that's listed on the 1860 census came from, because on the 1850 census, there isn't even a value added in the real estate category for William Hawkins' household, which makes me think his land in 1850 was probably mortgaged. And let's not forget that the Civil War hadn't even started as of the 1860 census, so none of my relatives can claim that the Civil War was a downfall for the elusive Hawkins plantation. If there was a plantation, it would have been the McClamey plantation, because it's Caroline's family that actually owned it. And it does make sense that she would have gone to her father's house to help out and for protection, while William and her relatives were off doing their army thing. So, in reality, it was probably McClamey's silver, not Hawkins' silver, that actually went missing. And knowing what I know about the McClameys, that silver was probably stolen from someone else back during the Revolutionary War or earlier. And I also believe that the 1850 and 1860 censuses and slave schedules disprove Allie's claim that all of the Hawkins children had their own personal servant, and why anyone would want to make shit up like that is beyond me. So I'm not really sure what picture Allie was trying to paint here, but when Sissy and her other siblings reminisced about this event, it was always focused on the missing silver incident near the close of the Civil War, and I never heard anything about personal servants and such. I do recall them saying something about the main house being burned down, and I figured that was probably Caroline's father's house. And I'm telling our half-cousin's version of the story because it's a prime example of how Aunt Allie embellishes stories. So, to what end though? I have no idea. I can't even begin to imagine why she would paint a picture like this when it's clearly not even true. And I don't mean to say that the two unfortunate souls who William Hawkins did own, I'm not saying it was okay because there were only two. I'm just saying that the picture Allie painted is inaccurate. And to be fair, our half-cousin did include more info about the Fullers and Hawkinses in the weeks after the war ended, but I'm not going to get into it here because it's not even true. I think you've heard enough of his bullshit anyway. Plus, it's just more of his drivel as he attempts to justify slavery, and I've spewed enough of that mess already. So, we're going to move on by ending this video. I think it's probably rather long by now anyway, comparatively speaking. And so, naturally, there's going to be a part 2. where I'll tell you some stories about Marion and Belle's marriage, among other things. So, until next time, later, Gators.